Well, thank you, Donna, for the generous introduction and for hosting today. I also want to thank Melissa Regan for organizing this event and asking me if I would be willing to speak. And finally, and not third, I want to just thank everyone for coming today. And it's really nice to see some of my former students here, and some of those students actually took my Women in Politics course at some point in the past. And so it's just really nice to be back with you. So what wasn't in my bio is, I guess, my areas of expertise. So let me just tell you a little bit about my strengths or my training so that you have a sense of the context under which I worked on the article that I'll be talking about and some of my research and teaching. So my training is in American politics. I have a particular specialization in race, ethnicity, and gender, also urban politics. I also do a lot of work now in recent years on migration. And I have one of my recent books is on Somali-Americans in the Twin Cities and Columbus, Ohio. And in fact, that book is now we are trying to use that book to make a documentary film that's inspired by the book. It's not actually the book presented in documentary film form because honestly, people probably wouldn't go see that documentary film, but the film is looking at the Somali-American experience in Minnesota, which is where the largest Somali-American population lives today. So in any case, COVID has slowed it down a little bit, but we're hoping to get back on track and make that documentary in the near future. So, so today, and I should also mention that at Trinity, my courses align very nicely with all of my research, but I think that today's talk aligns most closely with my teaching in Women in Politics. I've evolved the course title. It's now Gender, Politics, and Policy. Those of you who took the course with me years ago, it was probably called Women in Politics, which is still the name of the subfield in political science. But that course, and then also my racial and ethnic politics course, sort of combining those interests. So today, what I'm going to share with you is a snapshot of an article that I co-authored with another scholar that will be published in a book later this year that looks at the election of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that article, but I'm also going to talk to you about the 2020 elections and what we saw in terms of women and particularly women of color being elected to office, because it was a historic year. And I want to put that in context and try to have some interesting conversation about what we saw in the recent election. So I'm going to pull up my slides. So let me share my screen with all of you. And I'm going to also move you over a little bit so that I can see my slides. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm going to talk about the Ilhan Omar project. And the article that is going to appear in the book is called Ilhan Omar, Breaking Barriers for Muslim, Somali-American, and Immigrant Women. The chapter is co-authored with a colleague of mine, Professor Laurel Elder, who's at Hartford College. And Laurel has become really an expert in gender and politics. I mean, we were both trained in graduate school in gender and politics. That is her only area of research. And she has published a number of books, one that's coming out this year that is amazing. And it's about the partisan gap among women and the challenges that particularly Republican women are facing in terms of getting elected to office. And then she really highlights Democratic women and their advances. So Laurel has become a real leader in the field of gender and politics. She's also written about presidential spouses, a lot on parenthood and politics. And so when I was recruited to contribute a chapter to this forthcoming book that's also listed on the slide, a book that's called Historic Firsts in U.S. Elections, Gubernatorial, Congressional, and Mayoral Campaigns, 2018 and 19. It's a book that's edited by Evelyn Simeon. She's a professor at UConn, and she's a leading scholar in Black politics and a good friend of mine as well. So she brought together all of these scholars, particularly women of color, who do research looking at women. And we all contributed these chapters to this forthcoming book. And I recruited Laurel Elder because I thought having somebody with tremendous expertise in terms of publication record looking at gender and politics would be a nice complement to my expertise with Somali-Americans and racial and ethnic politics. So our chapter examines Ilhan Omar's historic congressional victory. So that gives you a little bit of background on the project itself that I'm drawing from today as I talk about what I've done in this recent publication. So to give you a little bit of background on Congresswoman Omar's historic first, Ilhan Omar's 2018 congressional victory garnered tremendous national attention for breaking not just one, but multiple barriers. In January 2019, when she was sworn in as the U.S. representative from the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, along with Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, became the first Muslim women ever to serve in Congress. Omar also became the first member of Congress to wear a hijab on the House floor. That was a historic first that required the overturning of a 181-year ban on head coverings of any type in the House chamber. Furthermore, Omar was also the first Black woman and first woman of color to represent the state of Minnesota in the nation's capital. She was born in Somalia and personally experienced the U.S. refugee resettlement process. She was one of a small number of first-generation immigrants serving she is one of the few in the 116th Congress, which was the last Congress, remains one of the few in the 117th Congress. And she's the first ever African refugee to serve. Omar brings other underrepresented perspectives to her work in Congress as well. She was 36 years old when she was elected to Congress, more than 2 decades younger than most of her colleagues. And this really stands out for those of you who have taken a course with me in the past, because as we know, most women who go to Congress are significantly older than their male counterparts, which has significant implications for their seniority and progression in terms of power in the House. So Omar came in very young, and she's also the mother of young children, which remains a very uncommon experience among women in national legislatures. She was also, going back before this congressional election, she was the first Somali-American woman ever to serve, actually the first Somali-American ever in the United States to serve in a state legislature. So she was elected to the Minnesota State House in 2016. And what's really remarkable is that she defeated a 22-term incumbent. And we can talk about that in a little while, but that was truly remarkable. So in terms of the research question and methodology in the paper, I'm just going to briefly go through this, not in great detail. I'm happy to take additional questions if you have them. But our paper and our chapter seeks to determine what factors explain Ilhan Omar's historic congressional victory. And to answer this question, we relied on a number of different forms of data. We analyzed news coverage in Twin Cities major newspapers from 2014 to 2020. We analyzed Ilhan Omar's newsletters. We analyzed the demographic details of her congressional district to understand, who voted for her and then who she was representing, both of those aspects of her leadership. And then we also did interviews, which is really the unique portion of our chapter, interviews with Somali-Americans in the 5th District. And as many of you know, a lot of what I do, I combine qualitative and quantitative data in basically all of my research. A lot of my work involves doing in-depth interviews. I'm pretty well trained and skilled now in doing that sort of work, even though my son doesn't necessarily believe that when I give him advice about interviews that he's going to do, but that's okay. I am actually an expert in this area. But this is the really important thing that helped contribute, I think, to the unique aspect of this article. I have very good access to Somali Americans because of years of working with people, doing in-depth interviews for my own book and articles, and now for my film. And it's a sort of access that an outsider doesn't typically have. there's a high level of trust. And so I was able to quickly do, I think I did about 30 interviews for this chapter. Okay, so
Stefanie, if I could just, sorry, can I just interject a second? We're hearing a lot of background sound. If folks on the call could please just make sure you are on mute, that would be terrific. Thanks so much.
And Donna, you should be able to hover over people's boxes and hit in the upper right-hand corner, you can hit mute them if you need to. Just a tip from teaching. I'm becoming an expert on remote teaching and dealing with these issues. So what we argue in our chapter is that a key ingredient of Omar's success was her ability to draw on the multiple path-breaking dimensions of her identity to assemble, inspire, and empower a diverse electoral coalition to become civically engaged. And we also draw on scholarship exploring the intersection of women's representation and party polarization to place Omar's congressional victory in a broader context, arguing that her ability to influence legislation, similar to most women of color, is very much tied to the fate of the Democratic Party. Omar and her progressive colleagues also have faced opposition from a Republican Party in Congress that has become even more dominated by white men over the past several election cycles. And there was also the unique aspect of the tension between Trump and Omar and also the squad, the other women of color who were elected at the same time, that is really noteworthy in terms of her leadership and her election, all of their elections really. And we argue that Omar's political campaigns and membership in Congress have sparked interest, civic engagement, and political confidence among marginalized communities in the US who prior to Omar's election had never seen someone who looked like them in the highest levels of political office. Now, if we look at Ilhan Omar's and her elections, what we see is that she had this historic victory that I mentioned before in 2016, where she was elected to the state legislature in Minnesota. She won a Democratic primary, and that's really where the competition is in Minnesota. It's that Democratic primary. But she beat out a 22-year incumbent. And I mean, all of you know, even if you've never taken a political science course, beating an incumbent is incredibly difficult. Incumbency is one of the major barriers to new groups getting into political office. And this is largely because there aren't limitations on incumbents running for election over and over and over, and they amass lots of different benefits. It could be money, it could be name recognition, it could be being able to deliver, be able to sort of boast the things that you've done, pork barrel projects. I mean, there are all of these benefits that incumbents have. So the fact that she was able to defeat an incumbent of that stature was a big deal. And there's actually a documentary film made that's called A Time for Omar, Time for Ilhan, that documents this congressional victory. Legislative victory. It was the State House. Then in 2018, she won the congressional primary and then, of course, the general election. This was an open seat. So this is a different situation. She didn't defeat an incumbent. She followed, in many ways, sort of a traditional path. Oftentimes people are state legislators before they run for Congress. That's the pipeline theory, that state legislative positions lead to congressional seats. Of course, Omar had only been in the state legislature for 2 years. So she hopped over to an open seat very quickly. And that seat was held by Keith Ellison, who was the first Muslim in Congress. And Ellison is now the Attorney General in Minnesota. So when the seat opened up, Ilhan Omar decided to run for it. And what we saw was that Ilhan Omar and the squad were elected to Congress in 2018, and they were reelected in 2020. And the squad has advanced or expanded. The initial squad included, of course, AOC, Ilhan, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley. They've added now Cori Bush, who defeated an incumbent in Missouri, and also Jamal Bowman from New York. So I have a picture of the new squad in a little while. But in any case, that's a little bit of background on the elections. Okay. So in terms of our argument in the chapter, we argue that while not the only factor, a key force behind Omar's success was symbolic empowerment, which is a concept that was developed by Evelyn Simeon in her 2015 book, Historic Firsts, which I showed you at the beginning. Evelyn Simeon's book, Historic Firsts, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes U.S. Politics. And in fact, this research project is intended to be, a chapter in Simeon's forthcoming book that looks at the application of her theory from 2015 in light of the 2018 elections and women's elections at the mayoral, gubernatorial, and congressional level. In the 2015 book, Evelyn Simeon analyzed the way that a number of historic firsts, including Shirley Chisholm, Jesse Jackson, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, were able to mobilize diverse coalitions through symbolic empowerment, which is the idea that marginalized groups can be inspired to political engagement and action by seeing someone who looks like them pursuing political office. Some of you who were here in 2015 at Trinity probably remember coming to Evelyn Simeon's big talk where she presented her research. Now, throughout her campaign, Omar argued that the historic nature of her candidacy and the fact that she embodied a perspective that was largely absent from Congress made her the best candidate to advocate for the issues affecting marginalized communities. The interview, newspaper, demographic, and other data that we collected for this project support the idea that this appeal was indeed effective in mobilizing a diverse winning coalition in her 2018 congressional bid. Omar drew on her experience as a first-generation immigrant, so this is right here, as a first-generation immigrant living in Trump's America to effectively mobilize the immigrant community. 15% of Minnesota's 5th congressional district is foreign-born, and while Somali-Americans only compose part of that total, the 5th district is home to the largest Somali community in the United States. And based on extensive interviews that I was able to conduct with Somali-Americans in that district, there was compelling evidence that Omar's candidacy and emphasis on the value of immigrants in American society resonated with those voters. Somali-Americans that I talked to spoke about how they were very much inspired by Omar and inspired by the fact that she had entered conventional politics for the first time and in an unusual way, in a different way, and that really inspired them to go out and vote for her. Omar was also, going to the next point here, Omar was also able to speak authentically to the Black Americans living in the 5th congressional district, who comprise 17% of the district, of the electorate. And after being elected to the overwhelmingly white Minnesota state legislature in 2016, for example, Omar helped create the Minnesota House People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. And she was a vocal proponent of, sort of exposing systemic racism. She wanted criminal justice reform. She received key endorsements from Black Lives Matter, and this helped her to both mobilize and win the votes of the Black community in her district. And what I want to highlight is that doing well among immigrant groups and the Black community was key, but not enough at all to win the district since it's majority white. And indeed, Omar is one of a very small number of members of Congress of color who represent majority white districts. In fact, this almost never happens. We still have issues with racially polarized voting, and white districts generally do not elect, or it's unusual for them to elect people of color to represent them. So she stands out in that respect as well. And Omar was also able to draw on her intersecting identities to also mobilize young people, especially college students, women, and white progressives. And what I will say is that the 5th congressional district represents part of the University of Minnesota campus. And as a result, it's one of the youngest congressional districts in the country, which is kind of a unique situation. And Omar was in fact younger than her competitors. And in her campaign, she emphasized experiences common among young Americans, such as her status as a renter, a young professional with college debt. And she connected and mobilized these young voters. And while the major candidates, all of the major candidates that were running for the 5th Congressional District were from the progressive wing of the party. Omar was able to secure key endorsements from progressive groups, including Move On and the Our Revolution, which emerged out of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential bid, and Women Winning, which is a powerful progressive women's PAC, the Political Action Committee. And in this way, Omar was able to draw on her intersecting identities to gain resources and to signal to progressive whites, women, and young people that she was their best choice.
Stefanie,
yes.
Can I ask, in terms of the demographics, you mentioned that it is a majority white district. Did your research or anybody's research that you've seen show that some of the non-progressive whites actually moved towards Representative Ilhan Omar in voting, or is not so much? Was it more about bringing in this coalition of young people, women, that sort of thing?
I think the coalition was the key. The coalition was the key. And electoral coalitions, I mean, so I don't think that she was, nobody's actually written about that. The biggest question is, how was she able to pull this off? And when we looked at the different areas and voter turnout and what seemed to be support for her, it really appeared that it was, she was just able to draw in that specific coalition, not really bring in new people. But she won by a larger majority in 2020. And that would be a really interesting thing to look at, Donna. Were there, if we did a poll, were there people who, were persuaded, hey, she's doing a good job for our district and she's got a high profile position?
Yeah, it would be something for those of us who feel the country's so divided, would give us at least some hope, perhaps, right? So thank you.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so here's the key. What was not included, or what was not a factor in her election, and this is really important, is that party support was not a key ingredient in her initial congressional victory. Although parties don't have control over their nomination in the US, over nominations, people can run independently. The parties are no longer like smoke-filled rooms where they pick the candidates who are going to run for office. Parties can and increasingly have played an important role in recruiting and supporting candidates for office. Both parties claim that they're interested in supporting women candidates and diversifying their elected officials, and have created these sub-organizations focused on these goals. I will tell you that Laurel Elder's research reveals in her new book that the Republican Party says that they value this, but they don't want to preference anybody, so they're not going to go out and look for diverse candidates. Whereas Democrats are more likely to say, the Democratic Party is more likely to say, yes, we value this and we'll do things to go out and support people. But in any case, party was not how Ilhan Omar got into office. It really wasn't even a part of it. Her first step into elective office came not as a result of recruitment by the Democratic Party or biding her time and waiting for her turn until there was a vacancy, which is the traditional path that is recommended for entering political office, but rather as a result of running against an established incumbent within her own party. So we also saw this we've seen this with some other women of color who have been elected to Congress, that they don't wait their turn, they step up. It's not waiting for retirement. It's not, so it kind of goes against the traditional recommendations of how we can get more women into office. So that's just an interesting side note. And she won her congressional primary in the same way, without rather than because of the support from her party. And this is similar again to AOC's route to office, Ayanna Pressley, and we've got some other examples of that as well. So let me conclude my talk about Ilhan Omar. I've kind of told you why we explain, or how we explain her historic victory, but I want to turn to, I want to turn to a couple of other things. I guess before I go there, I'm going to pull us back for a second. I want to say one more thing about symbolic empowerment. Symbolic empowerment, that theory of symbolic empowerment, not only helps explain Omar's political ascendance, but also illustrates the broader impact of her victory. So interviews with the Somali-American community suggest that her election to Congress may be continuing to inspire a new generation of young women who share aspects of her life story and are really interested in running for office. And there are candidates in Virginia and Maine, for example, who ran in 2019 in these unusual elections, who explicitly cited they're Muslim women, not necessarily Somali-American, but they're Muslim. And they specifically cited Ilhan Omar in their quest for running for office. We've also seen more Somali-American representatives in Minnesota, not only city council, but now state legislature. And so it seems like that was an inspiring path that she sort of put forward. So that speaks to symbolic empowerment and the value of that theory. Finally, Omar's rise to power and potential influence must be understood through the lens of partisanship and party power. Omar is now one of 51 women of color serving in Congress. All of these women, except 5, are Democrats. So I'll kind of move to this. I'll talk about this in a second. And in terms of the image young people see when they look at Congress, it's a stark divide, really. They see a diverse Democratic Party where women comprise about 40% of the Democrats in Congress, and women of color are pretty well represented, versus a Republican Party where women form about 10% of the caucus, and there are very few women of color. Additionally, it's important to note that the Democratic Party's return to majority status in the House in the wake of the 2018 election and their future hold on power is meaningfully dependent on the strong performance of women candidates of color, such as Omar and the other members of the squad. The opposite is also true. Omar's potential political power and the influence of women of color in Congress more broadly is very much tied to the fate of the Democratic Party, and more specifically rooted within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Their ability to influence policy beyond symbolic representation or just seeing a diverse group of people in office, but actually seeing them make substantive difference, policy difference, is therefore tied to both the congressional and presidential outcomes of 2020. And of course, 2020, we saw Democrats taking control of the presidency, and we also saw the increase of women and women of color in the 117th Congress that was just sworn in. So I have up here the general profile of women in Congress today. So there are about 142 women. There are 51 or 39%, 35.9% women of color. 46 of them are Democrats and 5 of those are Republicans. None of the Republican women, I should mention, are African-American. They're either Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, or multiracial. And we also have, I should mention that, I should say, women of color are 9.5% of the 535 members of Congress overall. So that's the House and the Senate added together. And I'm mainly putting these slides up so that you can think about what happened in the 117th Congress or the elections in 2020, and we can have a conversation about the outcome. Here's just a slide. This is pre-pandemic. So this is not the 117th Congress, but it's just a popular press image and title from an article. Record number of women will serve in the 117th Congress, including at least 51 women of color. So we heard a lot about women of color and their success in the 2020 election. This is just a picture of the new squad, which has been expanded by 2. I mentioned that earlier. So of course, this is a current image because they are wearing the masks. So it is COVID time in this picture. And this slide is taken, I took this from Laurel Elder's work. And this is kind of an interesting figure because what it's showing us is this point that I was alluding to, that is that Democratic women have been doing relatively well. This is not focusing on women of color, but this is looking at women overall. The Democrats have been doing quite well in terms of advances in terms of women's representation. What we have not seen is the Republican Party keeping up with Democrats. And women make up, 51% of the population, but they're only 26% of Congress overall. And where there have been advances, and I'll tell you, I've been teaching this kind of material, this course, for over 20 years. And the you know, not only have women in Congress in the US, have we not kept up with other industrialized democracies. We've always been behind, but the rate of change has been remarkably slow. Then we can also look at, and just put some more food for thought up here that we can discuss. This is another interesting slide, I think, because it's the percent agreeing that the US would benefit from more women serving in political leadership roles. And here we see that, that of those surveyed, and this was, I've looked at the data for this survey, it is a reliable survey. Democrats, and the margin of error is within, you know, the boundaries that we look for. Democrats are more supportive of this idea than what we see with Republicans, which aligns with the slow trend among Republicans and women.
Stefanie?
We can also look, oh, is there a question?
I have another I have another question for you, and it is a kind of putting together two of the data points that you had there. One was that you mentioned that there were 5 women of color from the Republican Party, and then in one of the slides that you showed, the difference between women in Democratic Party and Republican Party, there was a boost in the trajectory from 2020 to 2021. Yes, that slide. And curious, were any of those the women of color, or was that more of like a Trump bump there? If you
Some
know.
of them were women of color, and that's a really good question. So here's the, you know, we heard the most about Democratic women of color making tremendous gains in 2020. Republican women of color also had some impressive accomplishments. Representative Steele and Representative Young are both, I believe, Korean American women in California who won back districts in Orange County that Republicans lost to Democrats in 2019. So there's that. So I think that's part of it. Yeah. Does that answer it? Was there another question in there or not yet?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm so excited. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Say, they are Korean American.
Thank you.
And I believe that there might have been a seat in the Southwest that we lost to a Republican woman of color as well from 2018, from the 2018 elections.
Maybe you are very well. It could be. There is Jamie Herrera Butler, in Republican in Washington State. Is that who you're thinking?
Maybe that. But the other thing I was just going to mention, and she's not really associated with the squad, and I think that is by choice. But historically, here in Connecticut, Johanna Hayes, our Congresswoman from the 5th Congressional District. Johanna is quite a remarkable story. And she actually was the National Teacher of the Year. I pegged her when she was chosen in Waterbury as the local Teacher of the Year. I said to people, she is National Teacher of the Year material. And anyway,
she's amazing. I think the difference and the reason she's not part of the squad, right, is that maybe you'll agree with me or disagree with me, is that her policies aren't quite as progressive as the squad's agenda.
That, and because I've been so involved in politics, I know her somewhat. I think, you know, Tlaib made a couple of very unfortunate mistakes, like within 23 minutes of being elected. One should really watch one's language when you know you're being videoed. And I think that some of it might almost be Johanna's demeanor, but she also is, and I think she maybe had some differences. I think she's closer to Ayanna Pressley than, you know, but she's also elected from a majority white district, the 5th Congressional District, which is the most Republican district in the state. And the Trump numbers, like Torrington voted for Trump. So Johanna's reelection was really, particularly when she was so constrained in terms of being able to campaign, and her campaigning, when people meet her, they just sort of like are entranced. So, but she is, as I say, while not associating herself really with the squad, she has been reelected, and she is historic in that regard.
Yes. And in fact, I think she is one of the people possibly who was written about in the, that is going to be in the forthcoming book. But yeah, I'll second that she's amazing. And she'd be a great speaker now that I think of it at Trinity.
Yes,
if she would
she
come.
would. And the other thing I will just mention is that the Waterbury Republican, which is her local newspaper, local hometown newspaper, it's called what it is for a reason. They just had a couple of really good things to say about her in regard to Taylor Greene and how Johanna wrote the letter and handled all of that. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are great comments. I appreciate that. Okay, going back, these are some more slides that might, or another slide. This is my last slide, and then we'll have some conversation a little bit more. This is just another slide from Laurel Elder's work, and this is basically going back to that idea that I was talking to you about the pipeline. Those of you who took Women in Politics with me know that we talked a lot about why women are so underrepresented in U.S. legislatures compared to other countries. And we talked about all the theories in the literature. And one of them is, you know, as we see more women entering more traditional pathways to Congress, including, you know, state legislative service, we're going to see more women elected to Congress. It's also another part of that, what we call the eligibility pool theory, is that these other informal requirements, like, you know, being a member of a state legislature before you run for Congress, being a lawyer, being a business person, you know, having advanced degrees, that, you know, being in occupations that are traditionally seen as, you know, many of them are male-dominated professions, that as we see more women there, we're going to see more women running for office. You know, what's interesting is that there's also been research that shows that women, because women in this country still tend to be primary caregivers of children, they're entering Congress, the U.S. Congress, at much higher, when they're much older than their male counterparts. And, you know, there are a lot of women in elective office who have commented on this, that, you know, they're asked, who's taking care of your children, right? As though they couldn't do these two things at the same time. But it is very difficult. And part of the reason that we've seen some of the advances in women in state legislatures is that it's a lot easier to balance a full-time job. In Connecticut, our legislators have full-time jobs, plus they have the legislative responsibilities as legislators. Plus, if they have families, it's easier to juggle that within a state versus trying to go back and forth between DC or deciding where you want your kids to go to school and that sort of thing. What I want to show you, though, is that Democrats have been doing better than Republicans in getting more women in the pipeline in legislatures. And, you know, that could be one of the other reasons that we're seeing fewer Republican women running for Congress. So we're just not, you know, Democratic women are falling in line with some of the theoretical underpinnings of the gender and politics literature, whereas Republicans are really lagging. And that could have some long-term implications for the party. So I will open it up to questions, and I'm going to stop the share so I can see people. But I can always go back to the slides if there's a particular slide that stood out to you. I had to make some, you know, decisions about what to include, what I thought might spark some discussion. So please, let's open it up and ask me questions.
If I may,
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that in addition, Tammy Duckworth, in addition to passing the legislation or the regulation in regard to Ilhan Omar's headpiece, they had to pass special legislation, if you recall, when Tammy Duckworth had her baby, because she wanted, i.e. needed, to bring the infant onto the floor of the Senate. And there's this rule that, you know, nobody, et cetera, et cetera. And so you had, you know, all of these old white guys, you know, like Chuck Grassley, who's older than dirt. And, but they did end up actually, you know, probably having no clue what they were really dealing with, but they did have to pass a special, as I said, not a law, but perhaps regulation to deal with Duckworth's. And interestingly, when you talk about childcare, her husband actually has essentially gave up his career pipeline to become the primary caregiver to advance her political career.
Yep, and we do see that. I mean, things are changing in the U.S. They're just slower partially because of the family leave policies that we have in this country. But also it's just, we're still, it's still pretty traditional in terms of the expectation that women are primary caregivers. And thank you for bringing up Tammy Duckworth. I should mention that there are 3 women in the Senate right now, which is, a very small number. So we have Senator Masto, who's a Democrat from Nevada. She's Latina. We have Senator Duckworth from Illinois and Senator Hirono from Hawaii. And of course, when Kamala Harris left the Senate to become vice president, we no longer have any African-American women in the Senate. And so I guess I want to emphasize this, that yes, 2020 was great in terms of seeing advances among women of color in the election. There's still a long way to go. If I didn't already emphasize that, clearly enough, that it's great that we're seeing women of color in particular doing well in election and sort of going against the grain in terms of how they're going to get elected, who they're going to represent, what type of district they're going to represent. But we still have, again, a population that is, 51% women. And we see such low representation of women in political office, much less women of color.
I think Nelson had a question.
Yeah. Yes. What I was going to ask was to what extent are race and gender conflicting with each other and affecting the issue of women representation in the United States and across the world? And
yes.
I mean, because this is something that we don't focus on. We tend not to focus on because, well, when people think of racism, they think of it mainly coming from the ethnic majority, forgetting that even other groups can be racist to each other.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess
to put a more fine point on it, I'm, as someone who is not from this country but who is an interest in Asian American history, I've noticed that that Asian Americans tended to vote for the GOP for a long time, and this shift and a political real happened until the late 80s or early 90s.
So I guess, Nelson, what I will say is that there is a lot of research in my field on intersectional identities and how race, gender intersect. So even when we talk about, women in politics, women as a group, it's difficult to make generalizations because there is so much diversity. And it could be things like, well, we see, for example, that all of the women in Congress who are African-American, they're all Democrats. And we can understand, if we really study that, why that is the case. Why there are so few Black Republicans even in the nation, much less among women. We can also see certain trends among Latinos, but within Latinos, we have to really break it down and look at country of origin because we see big differences there. I guess my point is that yes, intersectional identities are really important, and teasing out how things play out is also really important and complicated. So even with Ilhan Omar, understanding her relationship with the African-American community that's not the African immigrant community is really important for us to think about. So your question is a good one, and we're definitely looking at those issues.
I see.
I think I saw Stefanie. Yeah, Stefanie had a question.
So to kind of piggyback off of that a little bit, I was wondering whether or not in the interviews that you had with folks so kind of a 2-part question, right? Like this whole notion of symbolic empowerment, what does that mean for political organizing and boots on the ground, canvassing, connecting with voters, getting them motivated, engaged to vote, because ultimately that's the whole point of running for office. But then also, what does it mean about identity politics more broadly? In talking about, there's been a whole lot of hand-wringing, I think, recently about don't do identity politics, that just segments the voters and blah, 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 blah. But it sounds like this whole notion of symbolic empowerment would suggest that we should lean into identity politics, right? And that might be a really good way of connecting with voters. And I don't know if that came up at all in your conversation today.
Yes, that's exactly the issue that I think Evelyn Simeon's research and our contribution or the chapter that we wrote in light of her theory is trying to get at. And the interviews do show that and the research in general, I would say, particularly in Black politics, indicates that having candidates of color can really mobilize diverse groups of voters to turn out. And it's also because those candidates, when they share their experience in the political system, that is largely different than the traditional American, those stories can really resonate with voters. And so, I know that there's this idea of, well, I don't know that anybody says this anymore, but yeah, we live in a post-racial society. We shouldn't talk about these things, or we shouldn't. Actually, Laurel Elder's research is showing that Republicans were saying that. They were saying, yeah, we value diversity, but we don't want to preference anybody. We don't want to give anybody preferential treatment. Well, it's not preferential treatment. It's trying to do outreach to create really what was John Adams, who said the country should be a portrait in miniature of the people who the representatives are representing. And we're so far from that. I mean, and we can look at many different factors. The gender difference between the number of women in society and representation in Congress is like, there's a huge gap there. But we also see a gap that's smaller with a lot of other groups. If we could look at social class, we don't see many people who come from lower class groups. We don't see people who don't have college degrees or advanced degrees. We don't see many people who are multimillionaires. We don't see people who are uninsured for the most part. With some of these women and members of the squad in particular, who have shared the fact that they were either uninsured, struggled with college debt. I mean, this is bringing a new voice to issues that I think matter to young people in America. When we look at, it's no longer credit card debt that we're talking about as being this big burden for Americans, it's student loan debt. And right, to have somebody say, I was a renter, I was getting public assistance, I grew up in poverty. Those things I think can really help mobilize voters. So that's a great question, Stefanie.
Stefanie, we have one last question from Charity, and then we'll have to wrap. And maybe a final thought that you could give us is maybe one or two things that aspiring allies, white allies on this conversation could do to try to help prevent or minimize maybe that backlash that usually happens when a person of color succeeds in getting to office. But Charity, what's your question?
Thank you. Hi, Stefanie. So I have a question regarding symbolic empowerment as it pertains to real power once you're in the job. And so a recent New York Times article last month, in fact, was titled, "Biden wants Harris to have a major role, but it hasn't been defined." And the article reported how there's a major effort by the Biden campaign, including Biden himself, to have Harris at every major press conference. She's always standing by his side. And the article notes how she could become just like a symbolic, like cardboard cutout almost. And when you think of the coronavirus, the economy, racial justice as it pertains to policing, what is the meaty role for Harris? And right now, a lot of what she's been given hasn't been as sizable. So I support the idea and understand the idea of symbolic empowerment, but symbolism does not equal power, and it doesn't equal a real seat at the table. What it equals or can end up equaling is a photo opportunity. And so I just would like to hear, the thoughts about symbolic power, empowerment as it pertains to real power.
Excellent question. So yeah, I mean, the second step to symbolic empowerment is substantive power. That's exactly right, Charity. And it's been a real challenge, because if we even look at, I think that the Harris comparison is excellent. I keep thinking that, I don't know what's going to happen, but when Joe Biden was vice president, he sure wanted to have some power. And he, of course, if we remember when he was campaigning, he did everything, right? Let's hope he puts his money where his mouth is and really has Harris do some substantive work. I think that remains to be seen. So there is that risk. And even, somebody like Shirley Chisholm, who was a historic first that Evelyn Simeon, focuses on in her book, she brought up some really important issues. She had a hard time pushing those forward. Jesse Jackson, who's another person, ran for political office, was unsuccessful in gaining a seat at the real table in terms of getting elected president or ever even serving in Congress. His son did temporarily, but so the second step is substantive power, and that is a challenge. And even the backlash that the squad gets, or the negative press that they get at times, or the lack of power of the Congressional Black Caucus, which the squad and all other Black members are members of. They have a hard time. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen for there to be true power sharing and a true reflection of the electoral coalitions that are getting a diverse group of people into office. So, I don't have a real answer for you, except that I hope that we start seeing change, but I'm not sure that we're at a point yet where we have a critical mass of legislators who can disrupt the power, structure that is in Congress, because it's really impenetrable and it's hard to influence things there. Did I kind of answer it? I mean,
Yeah, you did. I mean, I know that it's a difficult thing, and I'm just reminded, and I know we need to wrap up, but I'm just reminded quickly of how Biden was given, to run the economy by Obama, in terms of turn the economy, not run the economy, but turn the economy around. And so it's just, it's hollow to me to just have symbolism.
Yeah, so let's keep our fingers crossed and see what happens. Maybe that's going to be the next project. I guess I will end with a few thoughts. How can people better support candidates or I guess this kind of, there are a lot of things. I mean, one of them is, I guess I'll say this: increasing the number of women in politics, women in elective politics, and women of color in particular. There's one unique thing that seems to hold women back, and it's that they have to be asked multiple times to consider running for office. Whereas a lot of men appear, this is in the literature, this isn't just me like hypothetically speaking about this, men are more likely when they're approached or encouraged by someone to say, yeah, I could see myself doing that, right? I think we need to ask and tell more women that they have the potential leadership skills to succeed in political office. And I think that's what Joyce, did Joyce bring something like that up? I think it was Joyce, maybe mentioned this, or I'm just making it up. This is what I like to do when I teach, is I attribute things that I think are good to people who participate. But I think that that's one thing that we need to do, maybe encourage our political parties to look for and recruit more women, particularly more diverse women, to enter office at all levels. And I think that could make a big difference. And the Yale Campaign School is a good example of an organization. It's bipartisan, nonpartisan. They're trying to do that kind of work right in the state of Connecticut, but it's a national program. They're also trying to help women with raising money. The interesting thing is that even though initially it might be daunting to female candidates to raise the amount of money that it takes to run in US elections, once they're in office, once they're elected, they are doing just as well as men in terms of campaign war chess. And I would also say that, since we can't change our electoral system, which is one of the biggest reasons that we see low representation of women in the US Congress, the thing we have the most power over is pressuring our two major parties to do more, hold their feet to the fire.
Well, Stefanie, thank you so much for fielding all those questions and fitting in like an extra in your wrap up. We really appreciate that. I think this has inspired a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity, and I want to join everyone in thanking you for this inspiring conversation. I bet we're going to get you back to share even more as we do all of our part to get more women, particularly women of color, into leadership. So thank you, Stefanie. And thank you, Women's Leadership Council and Melissa and Trinity College for this awesome conversation. We put in the chat the post-event survey. Please do take it. We'll also send up with a follow-up email. And do reach out to Melissa if you have ideas for future events like these. Thank you.